Hello, my name is Des Smith, and for my oral presentation, I'll be talking about human trafficking. And in the introduction, it provides a brief overview of human trafficking, the concept, and the social impacts it has on society. The justification section dives into the support of the fact that human trafficking was against humanity. It tries to prove the negative impact of human trafficking. The objective section shows things that are real and not yet imagined. In this section, the goal of the study is brought out. Further, the background of the study provides the driving reason or the underlying force that necessitates the study. Indeed, human trafficking has negatively impacted people's life. Human trafficking refers to the buying and selling of people for sex, labor, and exploitation for commerce and various other purposes. Trafficking includes a wider concept such as marriages that are forced, extraction of tissues, organs, removal of various other body parts. Other areas covered in the introduction, we're going to talk about the study and trade of people. People are bought, sold for sex, labor, slavery, trafficking, and exploitation based on their sex. The entire issue covers factors in marriages that have been forced, extraction of the organs of the humans that are victims of trafficking, and including other factors such as the removal of organs of the body as well as surrogacy. It's also true that people who are trafficked are engaged in marriages that have been forced. This denotes a situation where people are engaged in a marriage without their consent. In most cases, the family members are compelled to accept the situation without their will. Forced marriages have been a result of the pressure of threats from the other party, for example, using financial threats or a position of power to convince the other person into marriage. Now, secondly, people who are compelled into human trafficking are forced to work as forced laborers. This is referred to as free labor. And when people are compelled to work against their will, they feel threatened that if they don't submit to work without pay, that they would be killed, violated, detained, or even subject to other forms of extreme relationships. Organ trafficking is executed with the purpose of the black market as well as the profits. And they're done and sold to other nations for the people. It's unfortunate that international initiatives around the world have paid attention to forced marriages and forced sex as outcomes of human trafficking. Failing to focus on the organ transplant is also another driving force for human trafficking. Organ trafficking is indeed another point of attention for the victims of human trafficking. There should be mobilization focused on the eradication of human trafficking. The initiative should primarily be driven by the international initiatives and organizations that advocate for the trafficking of people. This research seeks to check on why human trafficking is wrong, provide information concerning human trafficking, make further findings concerning human trafficking, and also to make the analysis of the findings. Additional target of the study is to reflect, and finally a discussion for study. For the justification section, people who are subject to human trafficking are usually subjected to the experiences that are shocking and also devastating. These are usually the effects of psychology both during and after the experiences of trafficking. Most people who survive usually experience the stress as well as the trauma. Besides, they encounter difficulties of depression, loss of memory, guilt, fear, anxiety, shame, depression, as well as some other difficulties that they may face in their relationships. It's true and it's proven that human trafficking has been a threat to societies across the globe. It's contributed to the deprivation of the rights and freedom of the people, and it contributes to the growth of crimes around the world. How do we educate the public to help them avoid becoming a victim of human trafficking? No single discipline has been able to address the problem comprehensively, but this study addresses an important yet unresolved issue. To help resolve this complex problem, I'd like to concentrate on education and psychology as the two disciplines. I've chosen education in a manner of spreading awareness of human trafficking through law. I have chosen psychology to help the general public understand the severity and the facts of human trafficking. The objectives of the study are to find out how to eradicate sex trafficking around the globe, to determine the best means of eradicating bonded labor, and to check on the effect of domestic servitude that is involuntary. Now we get to the background section. Society around the globe, especially sub-Saharan Africa, has greatly suffered the effects of human trafficking. Some of the effects that are interlinked to human trafficking are economic effects, social effects, and political effects. Trafficking the people who have provided manpower to society has indeed resulted in the suppression of the society. This is the reason that it has focused on the requirement of the cheap labor. Also, on the other hand, it has contributed to the increasing demand for cheap labor. This is probably the illiterate, the poor, and the violations against the health. Besides, victims of human trafficking have resulted in the issues of crime as well as the rise in prostitution. This is majorly centered on the control as well as coercion. This has resulted in the general effect of demand as well as the supply. It should be noted that the social effect of the trafficking is universal. The victims of human trafficking have lacked the freedom, deprivation, violence, as well as the torture. This greatly contributed to the torture. This in result generates the trauma. Trafficking people contributes to the issue of politics. It generates instability in the politics of the nations. In effect, this leads to civil unrest, militarism, conflicts, as well as the internal armed conflicts, and as well as natural disasters. This eventually leads to destabilization and the effect displacement of populations. This eventually subjects the people to the exploitation and the increased vulnerability to the abuse, forced labor, and increased effects of trafficking. Victims of human trafficking can be known to have an experience in the psychology and devastation. This is primarily after their experience of trafficking. People who are survivors usually experience stress, relationship difficulties, and various others such as guilt, anxiety, shame, loss of memory, depression, the list goes on and on. Now we get to the methodology section. The basic research method that was used in this section is quantitative surveys. The qualitative research interviews, the focus groups, the qualitative case studies. This study uses the survey method to collect data from the victims of human trafficking. This is based on the populations from victims of human trafficking. This was associated with the techniques and the data of the survey collection. Examples were the construction questionnaire, the methods of improving the accuracy and number, as well as the responses to the survey. This method was used to investigate the behaviors, characteristics, as well as the opinions of the victims of human trafficking. The research tools that were specifically used in the marketing or in the making of the question, as well as extracting the information of demography. The characteristics are the religion and ethnicity, as well as the income. The method helped in this collection of data from the groups that were predefined as target respondents to gain insights as well as information about human trafficking. Another method that was used in this interview. This method was used for gathering information concerning human trafficking as well as the effects on the victims and society. Primarily, the major interviewing types that were used are structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. They're the interviews that were undertaken in few places. They developed to have normal conversations that were aimed at determining many facts about the people who were trafficked, why they were hired, their greatest strength, and their weakest amongst others. Also in the interview, aimed at determining the major reason why people were objected to trafficking, how they handled the resultant stress, as well as outside pressures. Other issues in the interview sought to determine were the weakness as well as the exploitation of the people who were trafficked. And in the literature review section, according to Shirley 2017, human trafficking refers to the trade of people. This is executed for the reason that the laborer is forced. Other reasons that are done for trafficking are sex, slavery, and exploitation. This research identifies the disciplinary insight into psychology as one of the foundations to the complex problem of human trafficking. They commit trafficking to force an individual into marriage that is forced, or sometimes, in other cases, organs are removed. Various continents around the world have had issues of human trafficking. Issues of human trafficking are more prevalent in parts of Texas, New York, Florida, and California. It's both domestic as well as global crime. Victims may also be trafficked within their nation. Some at other times, victims may also be trafficked out of other nations. Examples of trafficking are within a nation or a country. The outstanding issues of trafficking are recruitment, threat, purpose, exploitation, and action, amongst others. Most of the victims of human trafficking come from Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and many other places. Some of the leading factors that contribute to the human trafficking in the Philippines are the low developments in economy, poverty, and other origins of the community. Limited unemployment, gender inequalities, limited opportunities of employment, public infrastructure, excess existence, large sizes of the families, as well as inadequate awareness amongst the people. Major elements associated with trafficking are action, recruitment, adults, threat, and exploitation. This literature reviews confirms that the identity of the disciplines and their insights are most relevant to education and human trafficking, about human trafficking. In our findings section, you'll see that more than 25 million people are currently trapped into forced labor around the world. More than 100,000 people are trafficked into the United States each year. 40% of the victims of trafficking into the United States come from Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. The state of Ohio is leading #1 in the country for sex trafficking. More than 80% of the families of victims of human trafficking suffer trauma, anxiety, and stress. 100% of all nations and authorities globally considers that human trafficking is illegal. The traffickers usually target strangers, people they don't know. A larger percentage of the foreign nationals are trafficked into the United States, with an even higher percentage of them being women and children. 100% of trafficking occurs in illegal industries. Largely, the process involves moving an individual person across the states, and it's only considered trafficking when a person did not consent to being moved to the place that they are being moved to. Most people who are trafficked usually are unable to go back to their place of origin. In most cases, they're locked. People who are compelled into human trafficking are forced to work as forced laborers. This is referred to as unfree labor. This is when people are compelled to work against their will. They are threatened that if they don't work, that they'll be fired, killed, violated, detained, subject to other forms of discrimination or abuse. It was also true that the trafficking of organs of people has been a common phenomenon. Most people who survive usually have many outside stresses that they deal with. In our critical analysis section, the data shows that more than 25 million people are currently trapped into forced labor around the world. This is an indication that forced labor is more prevalent around the globe. In particular, Asian nations have had a large prevalence of forced labor. The new data indicates that 40 million people around the globe are forced into slavery. Additional 152 million children are subject to child. The data shows that more than 100,000 people are trafficked into the United States each year. This is obviously an indication that the federal government needs to take action, check its borders, and up its security. These estimates are an indication that the more girls and women being affected disproportionately into slavery is rising and rising. This results in 30 million, even more than 70% of the overall total. Generally, a larger percentage of the victims of forced labor are women. Some of the effects that are interlinked to human trafficking are economic effects, social effects, and political effects. Trafficking people who would have provided manpower to society has indeed resulted in the suppression of the society. This has contributed to the massive creation of poverty. It's generated a cycle of global economic effects, and the reason it is focused on the requirement of cheap labor. The topic of this paper was human trafficking. I used this topic to show my skills in research. It's the reason why I covered issues such as abstract justification, introduction, background, objectives, methodology, findings, the literature review, reflection, critical review, as well as the discussion. Also, on the other hand, it's contributed to an increased demand of cheap labor. This is probably the illiterate, the poor, and people who have been violated against their health. Victims of human trafficking have resulted in the issues of crime as well as a rise in prostitution. This is majorly centered on the control as well as coercion. This has resulted in general effect of the demand as well as supply. Besides, it should be noted that the social effort of the trafficking is universal. This is a key element and most important to psychology and education. The victims of human trafficking have lacked the freedom, deprivation, and suffered violence as well as torture. Indeed, it's true that human trafficking is wrong. People who are compelled into human trafficking, both of our disciplines are in agreement of each other in every sense possible. It was also true for the tissue and organ trafficking are India, Israel, Pakistan, China, the Philippines, Nepal, and Iran, as well as other parts of Europe. They are done and sold to other nations for people. It's unfortunate that the international initiatives around the world haven't paid attention to what's really been going on. The interdisciplinary approaches that I chose have given me a bigger insight into human trafficking and it challenged my bias on the problem. This has given me an insight on how to properly map out future complex problems and narrow them down so that I may find a common ground between disciplinary approaches and come to conclusions that may help me understand. Overall, it was a great way for me to help reach a better understanding of the broad model, especially on a topic that I'm passionate about.